Australia's defence spending is in a, quote, holding pattern and won't improve the nation's military capabilities for at least a decade. That's according to a new report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which has warned that if war were to break out at any time in the next 10 years, our military would be forced to fight with the force it has today, which wouldn't be a problem if only China agreed to fight with the force it had, 50 years ago. Joining me now is foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Greg, have we got 10 years to prepare for the possibility of war?
No, we haven't, James. And this report is another damning indictment of the Albanese government's neglect and irresponsibility and dishonesty on defence. I've been saying this now for a year or so. The Albanese government came in with great rhetoric but no delivery. It's now well over 2 years into its term and it's done nothing. It hasn't increased defence spending as it says it did. It's still going on exactly the same funding lines as were outlined in the 2016 defence document. The tiny increase that it produced was gobbled up by inflation. Defence doesn't get its money compensated for inflation, and inflation was much higher than the budget papers forecast. The new increase in the forward estimates is piddling, it's nothing, and the 3.8 billion of it, the first, 2/3 or 3/4 of it doesn't come until the fourth year. That's 4 years from now. In the meantime, Labor is actually cutting back and destroying our defence capability. It's not going to modernise the Anzac frigates. It's already retired one frigate. It's about to retire another. It's now having great trouble keeping the Collins submarines in the water. It's not going to go ahead with the 4th Squadron of Joint Strike Fighters. It's not going to go ahead with the demining fleet. It's doing nothing about missile defence of our air bases up north. So on the first day of conflict, China could simply wipe out all of our air force with selected missiles. In other words, it's doing nothing at all, absolutely nothing. And in fact, our defence capability is degrading, as numbers of defence personnel have said. And this is a bipartisan failure because the coalition was just as bad beforehand. And we are asleep at the wheel. We are the psychological equivalent of the Afghan national government. We just believe the Americans will always handle it. They'll always be here for us. They'll always win. And they'll always consider that their blood and treasure should be spent on our security. A terrible attitude.
Yeah, well, Greg, hoping like hell nothing happens doesn't seem to be much of a defence strategy, and yet that seems to be where we are. I want to get on to some other issues, but just quickly, because you're all over this in terms of defence, just quickly, what do you think Australia should be doing right now? If they were to take the threat of war with China seriously, what are some simple things the Australian government should immediately do, in your view?
Two real simple things, James. First of all, if you're going to get nuclear submarines, you have to recognise that you're going to have to spend a lot more on defence. If you try to do it in your existing defence budget, you simply gobble up and destroy every other capability. So I support nuclear submarines, but don't get them unless you're willing to pay for them. If you're not willing to pay for them, better not to try to get them because you'll destroy everything else in the meantime. Secondly, we live, as everyone knows except the leaders at Fort Fumble in Canberra, we live in the age of missiles and drones. We don't yet have a single-armed drone. We're about to get one for the Army. The Navy has none. We don't have any significant quantity of missiles. We could make it very difficult for anyone to come anywhere near us if we had 30,000 missiles in northern Australia, all over the place, so that they couldn't be concentrated and destroyed all at once. We've seen in Ukraine and elsewhere that drones are critical in naval establishments. The Ukrainians are destroying the Russian capital fleet with cheap drones. We make cheap drones in Australia. The Australian Defence Force, led by its Duke of Plaza Toros, who always fight the last battle but three, won't buy them. Now, this is not rocket science. We could do all this tomorrow. We're rich enough. We know what we need to do, but we're just going to keep on doing what we've always done. And I think, in fact, the defence establishment doesn't want us to have a war-fighting capability, so that we'll never do anything significant and it'll just be left to the Americans. They just trust that everything will be with the Americans.